Okay, so we'll take this from scratch. Now, this is based on one letter, the letter B. Now, you can choose a different font if you want. I'm just choosing Impact because it's a very straightforward sans serif font. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Now, the first thing that I need to do is I need to get this layer into a 3D layer. I'm going to rotate this layer, but I want it to rotate in the correct manner so that it looks like the left hand side of the bee there is the spine of the butterfly and that the bee is flapping around that spine. So I need to change, first of all, its anchor point. The anchor point needs to be flush with the left or slightly off the left if you want to do that, if you want to create a tiny bit of space between the two wings. So I'll just leave it slightly off the left edge of the bee, and I'll open up its rotation parameters. I'm also going to open up a second view, and I'm going to have the left hand view here as top. So that's already set. Now the reason I'm doing that is so that I can see the flapping happening head on, if you want. I'm going to use rulers and guides to help me to do this. Rulers and guides are accessed in the same way as in any of the other Adobe packages. You hit Command and R and it will put rulers onto whatever view you have selected. The guides are then just dragged down from the top or dragged from the left. So I'll zoom in a bit on that so I can see it better. Now this first wing is going to set the flapping action, and then I'll create a second wing and I'll try and mimic or mirror that flapping as best I can. So I want to start from the point where it starts to flap from the top downwards. Now this flapping is going to be happening around the y-axis. So you can see that the y-axis on the active camera is pointing straight up. Because I'm looking straight down on my top view, the y is pointing towards me. So any rotation I do around the y will rotate in that way. I'll keyframe the Y rotation and position that or rotate that so that it starts at the top. Now, the reason I'm using the guides is so that I can visually match up the left wing's movement with the right wing. Okay, so the guide is going to tell me where that wing is when it's at the top of the flapping motion. I can pull the playhead out and change the rotation downwards to where it's finishing the downward motion. Drag another guide down, and instead of trying to line it back up with the guide again, I'm just going to copy the keyframe and paste it back up. Now my first decision in terms of speed is made here. I'm going to just think about how a wing flaps, and from what I know about flapping wings is that the downward flap is usually faster or appears faster than the upward movement. So I'm going to put the second keyframe slightly closer to the first keyframe and then leave a slightly bigger gap between the second and the third. Now at this point I'm going to play around with the velocity to get a more smooth motion in that flapping. I'm going to use an easing, keyframe assistant easy ease. It should smoothen the transition from the top to the bottom. Then I'm going to change the velocity slightly so that it takes a little bit longer to start the upward movement. So the keyframe velocity tells me that because I've applied easing, the incoming and the outgoing velocity is at 0 degrees per second and the influence is at 1/3. So I'm going to up the outgoing velocity to around 65, click OK, and then just play that out. And I get a nice smooth wing flapping. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that layer by Command C, Command V, just copy and paste. And at this stage I can label my layers right and left. So now the left needs to be animated. I'm going to pull up its rotation, not its position, its rotation parameters, and I'll leave the rotation parameter is open on this one as well, so I can see where the keyframes are. Reason being that I'm going to kill the animation on my new left layer, and I'm going to use the existing keyframes on my right layer to find the place in the timeline where I need to put the new keyframes on the left one. So I line the playhead up with the first keyframe here, keyframe the animation again, and this time I'm going to adjust the rotation so that it starts at the top on the left. So you can see that there, it's up on the left now as opposed to the right. Now I'm going to use my next keyframe button to bring me to the next keyframe that I positioned on my right wing. So that will mean that the keyframe that I place on the left will be perfectly matched up. Because these wings need to be symmetrical, they need to mirror each other's movement. So I'll change the rotation so that it's at the downward phase, and then go to the next keyframe on the right, copy that keyframe and paste it. Go through the same keyframe assistant, easy ease, to smoothen the movement, and then change the velocity, the outgoing velocity on the center keyframe to 65. Now what I should have is a perfectly even flapping motion. At this point I can start copying and pasting my keyframes down the timeline, so that's what I'll do. I'll copy them all, go to the last keyframe and paste them back over it. Go to the last keyframe again, paste. Last keyframe, paste, and you can do that for as long as you need your animation to continue. Copy those, paste them, so that is giving me the flapping motion on the two wings, or the two bees. Now at this point I'm going to go back to one view, and I'm going to start putting in place the null object that's going to allow me to pick up, move and rotate my entire wing animation here and move it around in 3D space. So the null object is the next thing. I'm going to create a new null object, make it 3D because I want to move everything around in 3D space, and the next thing I want to do is I want to pull that null object, whoops, not scale it, I want to move it so that its anchor point matches up roughly with the center of my flapping animation there. So the anchor point here is now down at the center, so that if I rotate it, it will rotate it evenly around, or it'll rotate those wings evenly around that anchor point. Now because I have it set to 3D, I can get my rotation tool. Now make sure that it's set to rotation up here, and I can reposition. Oops. First thing I need to do is to parent the two layers to that null object, then rotate the null object so that it grabs the entire butterfly and moves it around in 3D space. Okay, so this is what the null object is for. What I can do as well is I can pull up the scale parameter on the null object, and I can increase the size of the butterfly. I can grab the null object and I can move it. Okay, so this is where the null object comes in, and this is where pre-comping actually won't work, because if you pre-comp it, it'll just flatten that butterfly into a kind of a 2D layer. Now the butterfly is set up and animated. Next step is to create a camera. And this is the orbit cam again, because the first shot is the camera orbiting around the butterfly. I'll go back into two views and zoom out so I can see everything. Now, first thing that's going to happen is that the camera will start off from the left hand side, and orbit around to the right. So I'll keyframe the position parameters on my camera so that that happens at roughly over 3 seconds. I'm going to turn my motion path from linear into Bezier. And then create a curve or an arc around which that camera is going to move. So the action is seen there in the active camera. And just when it ends its arc, I'm going to cut to a new camera called POV, for point of view, which will be positioned looking down, which it pretty much is actually by default, but I'm going to move it a little bit closer. So this is going to be looking down the back of the butterfly, or up along the back, more accurately, as if it were on the butterfly's back. And then just as the animation is about to end, the butterfly is going to fly off. Now again, I'm going to use the orthogonal view to do this, and I'm going to leave it in top view. Now don't forget, if I want to move this butterfly, I'm not going to move its wings, I'm not going to move either of its text layers, I'm going to move the null object. So I'll pull up the position parameter, and if I wanted to, I could use the number value here for the Z to pull it off in space. Keyframe it first. Or I can use the Y axis here to push it off in space. And you'll see that it leaves a motion path behind it. And I think I moved it off backwards, but you get the idea. So the complete result of that then is that, oh no, before I do anything I need to make sure that the POV only happens when I want it to happen, so I'll trim back that layer. So what we have is an orbiting cam. It stops, cuts to the POV shot, and then the butterfly flies away. So I'll just go through that again. Starts with the orbiting, cuts to POV cam, looking up the back of the butterfly, and then the butterfly moves off into the distance.